attending know as well that I'm recording it. So yeah, I'll get started. So we'll get on with it. Nutrition for track and field athletes. Typically, I can end up talking for anywhere between 45 minutes, 60 minutes. The questions at the end will really dictate how long this talk is. So yeah, I'll zip through it. Grace kind of took my first slide off me, but just a very brief introduction to me. As Grace said, I do an awful lot of work with Athletics Ireland. I do most of their nutrition talks or workshops. I've also worked with Cycling Ireland and Dublin City University. I'm a sports specialist and a qualified dietitian, and this is pretty much all I do for a living. I work one-to-one with a lot of high-level athletes, Olympians, professional cyclists, triathlon guys, Ironman athletes, etc. All the way to couch to 5K, beginners, adolescents, you name it, I've worked with it. I myself was a former international race walker. That's the athletics link there. So if you have any queries in terms of things to do before, during, after training, the way to approach it, I'll be able to hook you up there. And I understand from the performance point of view why athletes think the way they do and might do the things they do. So let's have a look at what the science says that an athlete should or would ideally be doing to take care of their nutrition. So first up on the docket, here's what we're actually going to look at. We're going to look through protein requirements, carbs, hydration guidelines, hydration tactics, a recovery framework. We're going to look at some supplements. And then last but not least on the docket, we're going to look at energy restriction. So this is something that's coming up an awful lot, particularly during COVID. There's an increase in athletes looking at using this time to get in great shape or to catch up with peers they might have been behind, and big statistical increase in numbers of people with things like eating disorders, relative energy deficiency syndrome, female athlete triad. So the last two slides are going to be dedicated to that. So as a parent, a coach, or an athlete, how can you spot the signs of over restriction? What are the side effects and maybe what you can do about it? The rest of the talk will be primarily focused on the day-to-day stuff, and we'll do a bit of race day info as well. So at the end, if you have any questions on anything, just let me know. During the talk, if something comes up and you have a query about it, you should have the ability to put stuff into a chat or a Q&A box. Just type your questions in there. Don't unmute yourself and just shout out. Wait till the end. So on that note, before we start, then can everyone just make sure their microphones are muted? That would be great. Okay, so let's get on with it. Why do athletes need more protein? So I often find that if you want someone to change their dietary behaviors, or if you want them to engage with what I'm saying, they need to understand, or you need to understand, the reasons behind what I'm saying. So first and foremost, if you're an athlete, you simply expend more energy. That's number one. The higher your energy requirements are, the higher your protein requirements are. So generally speaking, if you're an athlete, you need more of everything, pretty much, even sleep. That's a simplistic explanation. Biologically, you oxidize more muscle, you have a higher rate of muscle protein turnover. So literally your muscle, your amino acid pool gets used and kind of recycled an awful lot more. There's more strain on it. Depending on how you're fueling your training, which we'll look at, you might be losing more muscle than you're taking in terms of amino acids. So really, really important that you do get more protein than those, say, people around you or sedentary individuals. How much more, we'll look at it there in a second. So I have written endurance here. So there's two different brackets really for protein requirements. Baseline, this is the absolute minimum I would want to see any athlete. And so if you have a male endurance athlete, 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram of body weight is what you want to be at in terms of baseline. So that's your minimum. The RDA for the general population, so people like me who aren't really that active anymore, you're talking 0.8. So it's a pretty sharp increase. You're talking about being 33% higher at an absolute minimum. So this is, as I said, male endurance athletes. We get here to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, and I have a note under there. That's the intake rate where you maximize muscle protein synthesis. That effectively means at that protein intake range, that is where your body makes the most amount of muscle possible, provided that you're using high biological value protein sources. We'll look at that in 2 seconds. Most female athletes could do with being in and around here, and any power and strength athletes, if you think about the nature of your sport, if you're a long jumper, a shot putter, a discus thrower, sprinter, you want to be as strong as possible. So when you're an endurance athlete, the protein requirements are based at helping you not lose muscle. The protein requirements here are helping you build muscle. So subtle difference, but it's actually quite meaningful. So if you're a female athlete, the reason you want to be here, whether you're endurance or not, during a menstrual cycle, your metabolic rate can actually fluctuate quite a lot, and you get increases in muscle turnover. So more than you would at rest, or say compared to a lad or a male athlete. And this 1.6 gram per kilogram mark is just a good place to be to offset any muscle losses. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of hard to simplify it, but I hope I've explained that okay. So just to reiterate, male endurance athletes, pretty much everybody else. There's a third column over here, and it's much, much higher than its two counterparts, 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. And I use kgs, just that's kind of the standard units. 2.5 pounds or 2.2 pounds is a kilogram for anyone stuck in imperial units. So the reason you want to go higher in your protein if you're injured, or if you're trying to lose weight, which, by the way, if you're under the age of 18, you shouldn't be trying to lose weight as an athlete. So for the most part, this comes into play if you have an injury. So ligament damage, muscle tear, you're after damaging a bone. And that's because most injuries that athletes sustain are in their connective tissue. And if you actually look at what tendons, cartilage, ligaments are made of, it's mostly collagen, which is essentially made of lysine and proline. They're two amino acids. And the best way to conceptualize what that extra requirement pertains to is, imagine in your house, like, let's say you can see that bit of the wall there. If something came and knocked that down, we would have to bring loads of new bricks, blocks, cement to rebuild that up. The same is true in your body. So on top of all your normal baseline requirements, if you have an injury, you physically have to rebuild and resynthesize new tissues with amino acids. So if you have an injured athlete, if you're the athlete who is injured, or you're the coach or the parent, promoting a higher protein intake can actually, number one, it can decrease the amount of time the athlete is injured for. Number two, it can decrease muscle losses. So if you have a snapped Achilles tendon or a meniscus tear and you have a limb that's immobilized, having that high protein intake stops losing all that muscle mass. So, you see people when they come off of an injury, they have one very thin leg and one normal leg. That protein intake can prevent that to a certain degree. So that's really important. I'm not going to dwell on this anymore. If you do have questions on these numbers, just let me know. Okie doke. So I mentioned high biological value protein there a minute ago. And effectively what that means is, if you are trying to get your protein intake in and you follow a typical Western diet, you're going to get high biological value sources. So things like dairy, fish, eggs, meat, offal, They're things that have all 20 amino acids in them, hence the high biological value. Things that are plant-based, so grains, cereals, beans, legumes, they're missing some of their amino acids, or they don't have a lot of the important ones. So they have a lower biological value prescribed to them. Typically speaking, if you're plant-based, vegan, vegetarian, even just once or twice a week, you want to make sure that you're getting all 20 amino acids in one sitting. Otherwise, you cannot build muscle out of that. And I know with track and field, whilst it's not bodybuilding, there is still a high degree of importance on making sure you can actually build your muscle. That's where recovery comes into play. So all 20 amino acids on the plate or at every snack. So how do you do that? If you're not consuming dairy, meat, fish, or eggs, you can have soya or soya derivatives such as corn or tofu. They have all 20 amino acids in them. So that's a complete protein source. Otherwise, combinations like peas and corn, grains and cereals, beans and legumes, nuts and seeds will do the trick. Good heuristic would be like a lentil and chickpea curry, any type of Mexican food, or like a soya yogurt with some mixed nuts and seeds in it. And that'll generally get you over the line. For the most part, if you have, say, a portion of chicken, fish, meat, that gives you somewhere around 30 grams of protein. An egg has 7 grams. Dairy, if you have yogurt, you're going to get somewhere around the 10-gram mark per pot, 15 if it's something like quark. Milk is 3 or 4 grams per 100 ml. And everything you see on this slide here, so a handful of nuts or seeds gives you around 5 or 6 grams. A serving of beans, which would be 3 tablespoons, will give you somewhere around 10 grams. And a serving of grain or cereals, so like a bowl of pasta or a bowl of rice, that's going to give you between 10 and 15 grams, depending on your portion. I know that's a lot of numbers. I do have some resources on that I will send over to Grace if anyone wants them. They'll be available there, or you can get in touch directly to get those off of me, just to visualize what I'm talking about. Okie doke, so we'll move on from that. Next thing we're going to look at is carb intake and why we might want to focus on our carb intake. And I wanted to use this slide as a bit of a segue into that, because there's an increasing trend in athletes avoiding carbs for the most part. And it's not necessarily a great idea. Where it comes from is if you cut carbs out of your diet, your weight drops very, very quickly. And what you're actually mistaken for fat loss is a drop in your body's glycogen store and the water that's typically attached to it. So if you have your maintenance calories, so if you eat the calories you expend on a high fat or low carb diet, you can still lose 3 or 4 kilos, but it's glycogen and water weight, not body fat. So that general misconception is why people think low carb diets are better for performance, because there's also the assumption that weight loss and performance are inextricably linked. So that kind of helps that narrative that a lot of people hold to be very, very true. But here's some facts about carbs versus fat. If you're watching this, there's a good chance that you either are a coach, the parent of an athlete, or you are an athlete. And you're somewhat invested in the process of training, performance. You're looking for an outcome on race day or on competition day. For pretty much every discipline in the track and field compendium of events, you're looking at explosive movements in a long jump or a high jump or a throwing event. You're going to be using ATP primarily for that. Higher carbohydrate diets are more superior for anyone looking to be explosive, even on a day-to-day basis. If you're a sprinter, if you're a middle distance runner, it's absolutely true. You're going to want to have a higher carbohydrate diet. If you're a race walker, a marathon runner, it's still the same. So this tends to come into play when you have an endurance athlete. They want to get fat adapted. If you have any degree of training behind you, you're already fat adapted. So just a couple of other things to maybe point out why we don't want to necessarily be using fat on competition day or in most of our training sessions. as your intensity increases, so when we climb up our intensity ladder, our ability to use fats drops. And that's primarily because a lot of the blood supply goes to our muscles. And if you think about where fat is stored in your body, it's in and around your tummy. So you lose that blood supply to that adipose tissue. So number one, you get a big drop in your ability to transport fatty acids around your body to your working cells. So there's a supply problem if you're looking at fat. Right now, I'm not the leanest, I'm not the heaviest person. I have about 60,000 calories worth of fat on my body. Whilst in theory, that means I can exercise pretty much forever. That's not actually true. Eventually, my glycogen levels will run out. I'll start making lactate at very high rates, or the rate of perceived exertion will get so great that I won't really be able to continue. And from an economy point of view, fats are about 10-15% more costly to burn. So this is more relevant for 10K runners, race walkers, half marathoners, marathon runners, anyone watching who maybe does triathlons or coaches triathletes. They did a study in race walkers recently enough, which is, right up my street. It was bedtime reading for me. But what happened was they put athletes on a high fat diet, athletes on a high carb diet, and they compared them, say, VO2 max and over a 10K time trial. And the interesting thing was the guys who were fat adapted, their VO2 max was higher. All of the lab results would suggest they were better athletes. However, when it came to an actual time trial, they were about a minute to 2 minutes slower over 10K. And these are all high-level guys, Olympic athletes. And what the researchers basically concluded was that from an economical point of view, the actual things that matter, feet on ground, heart rate heart rate at pace or time per kilometer, all those things drop dramatically if we're using fats. So for that and a whole multitude of reasons, we're going to want to focus on getting the carbs in the door before, during, and after training every day, particularly on a competition. So if there are more specific questions on that, please let me know at the end and we can go through it. But again, here's just a visual before we get into the actual numbers on carbs. So you can see here what I'm talking about. As the intensity rises here, your ability to use those fats drops. And somewhere in here is an easy paced run. So you can already see that natural reliance on carbs starts to increase as fats decrease. If you're doing an easy 30-minute recovery run or walk into the shop, you'll be using mostly fats for the most part. If you're looking to perform, typically a marathon runner will be around here. 10K is around here. 5K, 3K, middle distance race, throwing, it's all up here. So that's a good visual. Sitting on the couch, you could oxidize fat, but sitting on the couch is not in the track and field list of disciplines, unfortunately. So there's no point in getting very good at it. So carb tactics, how much do we need? The IAAF, so I suppose the overarching governing body for athletics globally, they commissioned a bunch of research to be done in 2019, I believe. And the world's best sports scientists, they came out with a set of tactics, guidelines for nutrition professionals to bring to athletes. And when it comes to carbohydrate intake, here's a really good rule of thumb that you could look to figure out on any given day, how much carbs do I need? And obviously, everything here is in grams per kilogram of body weight. And the reason we do that is just if I'm basing it off my own clients, I have clients who weigh 50 kilos and clients who weigh 150 kilos, all of whom exercise regularly. If I just give a blanket guideline of 300 grams per kilogram or 300 grams of carbs per day for a 50 kilo athlete, that brings them up to this range. Whereas for a 150 kilo athlete, that's 2 grams per kilogram per day. I hope that makes sense. So to fully be able to implement everything I'm saying, you need to know what you weigh. So just jump on her scales. And, you know, these slides will be available. I'll be sending this on to Grace. And I think she should be able to disseminate it to you guys watching, or you can get in touch directly and I'll be able to give you the link to this. So if you know your weight, you can work out your protein requirements, your carbohydrate requirements, and I'm going to show you how to work out your hydration requirements in a couple of minutes' time. But take it from me that these numbers are more or less gospel, okay? Any athlete, anyone training with any degree of regularity, that's what an athlete is technically. Doesn't matter how fast you are or what level you're at, performance and effort is all relative to the person. Minimum of 4 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So that's essentially to allow for the fact that when you exercise, you expend an awful lot of glycogen, and that needs to be filled up again. Your glycogen tank needs to be filled up pretty quickly. So if you have someone, let's say they train every second day, on a rest day, you still want that carb intake to be nice and high. This would be considered high for a normal person. And the reason is glycogen takes around 24 hours to recover. So if you train today being Friday, you're still recovering technically for 72 hours, but your glycogen tank will still not be full the following day. And as such, it's important that you're never really lacking in carbs, particularly if you're looking to perform in any given session. So the best way to describe this, imagine this is your glycogen tank. The higher your glycogen tank is in terms of fullness, number one, the better you're able to tolerate exercise. So if you've got a threshold session, a repeat sprint session, an important race, key indicator session coming up, if your glycogen tank isn't full, you're going to struggle an awful lot. Number two, recovery is heavily contingent on glycogen levels. So if your glycogen level is low, that suppresses your immune system and it actually dampens muscle protein synthesis. So let's say you do a real tough workout in the gym, you're doing lots of neural work, lots of sprint work, or for a race walker, could even be a technique session. Glycogen low, recovery is poor, muscle protein synthesis is poor. In the deep sleep fraction at nighttime, where you typically make new sinews, make new fibers, neural pathways, that is heavily impeded. So you're not getting anything like the same recovery that you would have if your glycogen was nice and full. And as that glycogen tank drops down, even from a psychological point of view, how hard you perceive exercise to be increases. So it's really, really interesting. And for that reason, if you're training with any degree of regularity, because that tank takes a good while to fill up again, you need to be constantly getting your carbohydrates in. I know it almost sounds cliched at this stage, but balanced meal, getting your 5 a day, getting your whole grains in, getting some carbs in right after training, those things are really important. And it's easy to discount nutrition and say, it's not that important. Because when you go training, like if you do a bunch of hill sprints, or if you're like Grace, who's still logged in with us at the moment, I think, and you know, you race a 10K at a high level, you feel that, you know, you're out of breath, your legs hurt, your chest might hurt if you have asthma like me. And you compare that to something like eating a banana or making sure you put seeds in your porridge in the morning, it just doesn't seem very tangible. The immediate effect isn't apparent, so people tend to discount it as not very useful. Don't do that. That's why I'm making such an effort to explain why it's important. Okay, so that's minimum then. Generally speaking, depending on how hard your activity is, then you're adding in 2 grams per hour of exercise. It depends really. So just to explain as well, the reason I have a range here, again, if you're over 100 kilos, it's not really feasible to eat 500 grams of carbs a day. 400 might be more manageable. Whereas, you know, the same way that if you do an hour of exercise, if it's an hour of, you know, mobility work, that obviously doesn't have the same calorie requirement as an hour of a threshold session. So that's what the range is there. Go for the lower number here. If you're under 100 kilos, go for the lower number in these brackets here. If it's an easy session, go for the higher number if it's a tough session. I really hope that makes sense. If you do have questions on that, just let me know. So just as an example off the top of my head, I'm approximately 80 kilos. So if I do a 1 hour tough session, if I was to just, after this talk, start 60 minutes running as hard as I can, I'm looking at getting in somewhere around 480 grams of carbs for today, when all is said and done by the time I go to bed. If it was a tough 2 hour session, I'm looking at being somewhere in and around 560 grams of carbs for that day. So that's how you work it out. Whereas if I was doing an easy hour, 400 grams of carbs, an easy 2 hours, 480 grams of carbs. So does that make sense? Yeah. Anyways, if people are not sure about this, ask me at the end and I'll go back on it. Or if you yourself want to pop me over your weight, I can work it out for you before we finish up for tonight. Okay, so I often find it's helpful to visualize numbers, particularly with the carbs. These are really the most important things for athletes. People easily meet their protein requirements for the most part. This would be a screenshot slide. So, if you have your camera, I have no problem with it. You can take a picture of this one, or this would be one to save on your phone when you get the presentation if you want it. What does 10 to 15 grams of carbs look like? 20 to 30 grams, 50 to 60 grams. That's important to know. And it'll become apparent. I have a framework for you. It'll be kind of the next screenshot slide as to how you put all this information into a bit of a food diary or an actual day of eating. So this would really be a small snack. When you get to here, then this would be a light meal, maybe a post-training option. And this is what you're looking at getting in on any given breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Obviously, the portion is going to be a little bit bigger if you're heavier. For the most part, snack, small meal, recovery training, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So that's approximately what you're looking at there. So I'm not going to go through all of these individually. I'd rather use the time we have to answer questions than just read out arbitrary food items. It's there. You can look at it. If you have questions later on, you can ask me. So I'm aware again that I'm sure I have coaches, athletes from different disciplines, maybe people who are into track and field, but also doing marathons, Ironmans. And this is a slide I stole from my Instagram at eLynchFitNut, if anyone's wondering. Basically, what I was trying to show here was during training, how many grams of carbs would we need to get in the door? And general rule of thumb, hydration during training, we look at it in a couple of minutes anyways, you're talking around 500 mil per hour of exercise. So that's kind of your standard baseline. Any given session you do, you're looking at 500 mil per hour. And that's a really good habit to get into. We'll explain dehydration in a couple of minutes, but it can really knock your training quality and your performance capability on your head if you're not staying nice and hydrated. So if you're going out for an easy hour, it depends. If you're doing it first thing in the morning and you've skipped breakfast, which I don't recommend, you might want to get anywhere from 0 to 30 grams of carbs an hour in the door. So 30 grams of carbs if you've not been able to have breakfast, or if you have a poor appetite in the morning. So that would be something like a commercial sports drink, or a homemade one with some orange juice, water, and a pinch of salt. That will cover you there. If it's later on in the day and you've already eaten bits and pieces and it's nice and easy, you don't need to fuel up for an hour. Just make sure you're nice and hydrated and then recover properly afterwards. As long as your overall requirements are met, that's the main thing. If you're going anywhere for an easy 1 or 2 hours, or if you have a hard session that's an hour or less, 30 to 45 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So that would be, you could get away with your Lucozade Sport there again. You're probably using something like the High Five Energy Carb Powder to hit 45 grams of carbohydrates per hour. As our sessions get longer here, and I'm aware that, this upper bracket here might not apply to most people or anyone really watching, but if you're on a long session at the weekend and it's 2 to 3 hours long, you're really looking at getting 60 to 75 grams in the door. This is where you realistically have to have a carb powder like Martin 320, Torque Energy, High Five Energy as well. I think Ross Nutrition do carb powders. That's an Irish brand. But you would need to be doubling up. So carbohydrate powder and maybe a gel per hour. And you'll see here, if you're going for an easy hour or two, you're going to want to do that as well. So just quickly to explain, why is there a difference in requirements based on the intensity? Well, simply put, in your body, for the most part, you have enough glycogen to last around 100 minutes. So the hour and 40-minute mark. And when you run out of that, that's when you hit the wall. That's when your heart rate randomly jumps up from 150 to 180 beats at 5-minute Ks or whatever it is you're doing. And generally you start to have a pretty bad time. The harder you're working, the higher your carbohydrate oxidation is. So a 10K runner can actually completely go through all their glycogen stores in the 30-35 minutes, if it's male or female, during that event, whereas a marathon runner can get by up to an hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes. Now, carb loading does come into play, and it can buy you some time. But generally speaking, the longer your event is, the reason you're taking on carbs during that session is to buy yourself time from hitting the wall. That's essentially all it is. It's a delay tactic. So I hope that makes sense. Marathon runners, you're probably going to be at the 75 gram per hour mark. Someone like Eliud Kipchoge, Tour de France riders, up at the 90 gram mark. Most people don't need to do this. So I'm assuming for the vast majority of those watching, here is where you need to be paying attention to, particularly longer weekend sessions. Again, if people have questions on this, just let me know at the end and I'll address them and explain them a little bit more clearly and specifically. So speaking of recovery, what do we do? Like when I say recovery, what am I talking about doing? What are we looking to achieve here? ASAP, or within 30 minutes, you're looking at getting around 1 gram per kilogram of high glycemic index carbs. Some people might call those the unhealthy ones. So what I'll often say to someone with a sweet tooth, use it right after training. So something like a bowl of Cocoa Pops or even a handful of jellies, that's actually okay right after training. What you're trying to do is piggyback on the fact that with exercise, you get this big spike in insulin sensitivity and glucose transport. And if you get those carbs that you absorb like rapidly, your glycogen tank starts to fill up much, much quicker. There's a specific type of glycogen called proglycogen that starts filling up within that 30-minute mark. And jumping on top of that timing window for carbs, your tank can be about 2/3 more topped up than someone who isn't as expedient about getting their carbs in after a training session. So real practical tip number 1, high carb intake as soon as possible right after your training session. Simple carbs, cereals, a bagel with jam, fruit smoothie, all of that stuff is what you're looking for. You will notice that I don't have protein on this slide, and for good reason. As long as you get your overall protein intake met and you do it with either those complementary sources or those high biological value sources, and you eat with some degree of regularity, that protein window does not matter. So that is actually a myth, that you need to get protein ASAP after a session. You're not going to lose your muscles. It won't make you more likely to have an injury. It won't, it's not going to dampen your performance. Carbohydrates. That is the thing you need to have in the back of your mind as soon as you finish a training session, which is also good for people who don't feel particularly well after exercise. Proteins are very osmotically active and they can be harder to digest, whereas a bowl of Rice Krispies or a Rice Krispie square or even a banana, it's quite light in comparison. So that can be a little bit more palatable for an athlete who kind of has a sick tummy. So that's what you're looking at immediately. Within 2 hours of finishing a training session, you would be looking to get a balanced meal. So you would want to have some protein in that. for sure. And when I say balanced meal, what do I mean? Imagine or pretend, which is easy because I have a very round face, but pretend my head is a plate. You're looking at getting around half the plate covered in carbs, quarter would be veg, quarter would be protein. So that's particularly after a training session. For the most part, say if it was lunch or if it was just general healthy eating guidelines, half the plate would be vegetables, and then you'd have quarter protein, quarter carbs. But just for that recovery meal, you have carbohydrates, quarter for veg and protein. I hope that makes sense. That's very wordy, I'm aware, but simply put, something like a baked potato or a pasta bake will more than foot the bill. So that's fuel. What about fluids? I mentioned briefly 500 ml per hour of fluid intake to keep you nice and hydrated during your session as a general rule of thumb. But afterwards, what do we want to do to rehydrate? Well, not everyone's going to do this all the time, and you can do this as an experiment. Weigh yourself before and after a session. Whatever your weight loss is, multiply that by 1.5, and that's what you're looking to consume in fluids. So that's a general rehydration guideline to help build back up your fluid balance. So as you sweat, typically speaking, for the most part, unless you have something like cystic fibrosis, you lose an awful lot more water relative to your salt content. So when you lose water, the concentration of your blood, it increases lots. That puts pressure on your kidneys. It can affect your blood pressure, your electrolyte balance. You want to replace a lot of that water. And what they've found, the best way of doing that is multiplying that weight loss by 1.5. So let's pretend I did a big training session, 2 hours in a gym on a treadmill, and I lost 1 kilogram. I'm looking to consume 1.5 liters of water with 1 or 2 electrolyte tablets popped into that for better hydration or water absorption in your intestines. And I'm looking to consume that within 3 hours post-workout. So I don't have that 3 hours in there, but that's the time on that. So I hope that makes sense. That's the easiest way to nail your recovery post-workout. Speaking of hydration, here's an interesting factoid for you. 1% dehydration. So if you feel thirsty, your kidneys have already started to reabsorb water from the tube that attaches them to your bladder, and your blood pressure is changing. You're getting changes in vasopressin secretion and angiotensin levels, stimulating thirst. Thirst usually indicates you're between 1 and 2% dehydration. If you're at that 1% mark or you're feeling thirsty, you have lost approximately 10% of your performance capability. This is really only relevant for events that rely on your aerobic capacity. So probably anything 400 meters or more. Anything less, or kind of jumping, throwing events, you might get away with it. Cognitively, it mightn't be the easiest thing for you, but anyone where, VO2 max is a predictor of performance, pay attention to this. 1% dehydration is about a 10% drop in aerobic performance. If you get to 2 or 3% dehydration, the longer your event is, the more of an effect it has. You can be looking at something up to a 30-40% drop in race performance or finish time if you're a race walker, marathon runner, half marathon or something like that. And that was really shown in Doha or in the Beijing Olympics, where we had athletes coming in 30-40 minutes off their qualifying time or their PB time. Hydration, heat management, really intrinsically linked. So when you get dehydrated, it affects you for about 3 days. And effectively, why it's a problem: when you get dehydrated, your core temperature starts to increase. And when that happens, our body's natural response is to sweat. So more blood goes to the surface of our skin. That means our gut and our muscles are losing blood supply. That's a problem for 2 reasons. If your gut is losing more blood supply than it already is during exercise, it makes tummy problems more likely. So you might find it on long training sessions or really tough ones, or in the summer, you get more tummy issues. That's possibly a mitigating factor. And number two, if your muscles lose some blood that's being, I suppose, brought to the surface of your skin, that's less oxygen, that's less glucose getting to work in muscles. That's the performance drop. So with less oxygen and glucose, your body is making lactate at earlier or lower intensities, if that makes sense, just to explain it. So what can you do about hydration? Baseline requirements, 35 mils per kilogram of body weight per day. That's all really easy to do. 80 kilo man, it's something like 2.8 liters per day. And that can be water, it can be pink cups of tea, it can be coffee, anything. It's not water and then all the other things you want to drink. It's total fluid intake. And you're looking at approximately 500 mil per hour of exercise and multiplying your weight loss in a training session by 1.5. Simply put, that's how you can manage your hydration and be 90% of the way there. To be more specific, you'd want to do things like a sweat test, which is easy to do, I guess. Weigh yourself before and after a session, drink nothing during it, try not to go to the toilet between weigh-ins and see what the weight loss is. I do have athletes who lose 1,000 mil an hour. What's important to note is during training, you can't really actually drink more than 600 mils of fluid per hour without feeling sick. So if you do have a high sweat rate, it might be worth getting in touch with me, someone like me, to see how you can manage that. So that's hydration. I'm going to zip on here as it's 10 to 8 and I don't want to keep you guys all night. I could stay talking all night, but I'm sure you guys don't want that. So training framework, I did say I was going to try and put this into practical terms. So let's say your training session is here, and it's a weekend session, a big training session. It's a key one, and you're training at around 12 o'clock on a Saturday. So tomorrow, let's pretend you're training tomorrow at 12 o'clock. What are you looking to do? Tonight, high carb meal to bring your glycogen levels up, to keep your blood sugar nice and stable. And basically what we're trying to achieve is glucose availability and glycogen normalization. That's what the research says is the goal with that carbohydrate intake. So this will be aimed at about an 80 kilo man. So someone like me, if I had a tough training session tomorrow, pasta bake, 1 or 2 baked potatoes, approximately 80 grams of carbs. So you're looking at 1 gram per kilogram of body weight in that meal pre-bed the night before. Breakfast, again, 80 grams. That's approximately an 80 gram meal. If you have a very long training session or it's race day, breakfast around 3 hours beforehand, you want it to be low fiber, low fat. So you'll see here that what I have here, very little fiber, like you wouldn't necessarily call it healthy eating guidelines. And you keep it low fiber, low fat to minimize your risk of tummy problems. So keeping it to simple carbs, not even whole grain products, for the sake of a key session or a race day would be really important to minimizing any, we'll just call them undesirable events. I think you guys know what I'm talking about. Paula Radcliffe events, Katrina McKiernan type stuff. You don't want that happening. This is a really simple way to avoid that. Okay, so that breakfast is around 3 hours beforehand. 90 minutes beforehand, if you want to use caffeine, which we're going to look at in a minute, I would need something like a double espresso, and I might have a banana with that just to top up my blood glucose, and the caffeine will have kicked in. It takes 45 minutes to kick in, and by the time my training session comes around, then if I'm doing a session over an hour, as I said, I'm going to be using my high five energy powder or equivalent and a gel if it's needed. And one thing to note, if you want to start a training session in a neutral hydration status, you're looking to sip 5 mils per kilogram of body weight. So it'll be 400 mil for someone like me, over the hour and a half before you start. That helps you achieve euhydration. If it's hot, if you use chilled water or chilled sports drinks, put them in the freezer before you go, or before you need to drink it. And the cooler it is, the cooler your core temperature will be when you start. In summertime, the lower your core temperature is, the better you perform in an endurance type event. So that's really practical tip there for anyone looking within 30 minutes of finishing, then getting my simple carbs, and within that 90 minutes to 2 hours, you're getting that balanced meal. That's it. So for everything I've said, that's kind of what it looks like. That's what it boils down to. Depending on your weight, dietary preferences, age, you might be doing a double espresso. If you're a teenager, it'll be a little bit different. I can be more specific if people have specific questions. So I did say we would look at supplements there, and this is one of the last things we're going to look at. So as part of those IAAF guidelines, they come up with 5 evidence-based supplements. So there's 5 supplements, not nutritional supplements. So there's a bit of a difference. So when I'm talking about supplements, I'm talking about ergogenic aids, supplements that have an impact on sports performance. There's also nutritional supplements, things like vitamin D, omega-3, iron, which I haven't gone through in this talk, but take it that most Irish people need to supplement with vitamin D, at least from the months of October through to March. And if you're plant-based or if your iron levels are low, you female athlete triad, you probably will need iron. If you have amenorrhea, stress fractures, you will need a calcium supplement. That's really more specific to your dietary requirements and I suppose clinical background, but I wanted to keep it sports specific. So we're looking at the 5 evidence-based sports supplements. First one on the docket is creatine monohydrate. I more or less use this with all of the athletes I work with. So professional discus throwers, cyclists, Olympic marathon runners, all using creatine. Not recommended for anyone really under the age of 14, 15, or if you have a kidney condition. Pretty much anyone else can benefit. So it's kind of reserved in our minds as something bodybuilders use. Not really the case. Creatine increases your body's level of phosphocreatine. It helps you do repeat sprints better. So if you have a kind of a tempo session, hill sprints, gym work, you just perform better in those sessions themselves. And over the course of a season, that allows you to deduce better stimuli from your training. So you get a greater kind of improvement curve, bigger gains in muscle, bigger strength. And interestingly enough, it's not written down, but for marathon runners or anything like that, it increases your body's ability to store glycogen, which is really, really interesting. So that's creatine. I think I have a question just jumping in there on that. I'll answer it at the end. Beetroot juice then is the second one. Beetroot juice, essentially what it does is it makes your arteries widen, something called vasodilation. Now, there's a lot of hype around beetroot juice. It can be useful if you're untrained. So the more trained you are, the more innate those exercise responses are. So if you have someone just doing their first ever couch to 5K, they're having a hard time running, beetroot juice can really help them in terms of getting through the session and making it feel a little bit easier. Whereas if you have, let's just go with a marathon runner, a trained marathon runner, or someone medaling in a 10K at the national championships, when they exercise, their body does that naturally. Okay, so the more trained you are, the less effective beetroot juice is. So for beginners, people who are new to this, finding like aerobic stuff tough, beetroot juice can help. Might be worth a shout on race day. If you're going to have it 2 hours beforehand and try it in training once or twice first. It's not very palatable. I personally don't like it, and it makes me personally feel sick. So it's one I avoid. Some people swear by it, but that's the actual research on it. If you have a VO2 max of under 55, it's not going to be very effective. Third one there, beta alanine. So beta alanine is essentially a lactic acid buffer. You might see 400-meter runners using it. You might see a middle distance runner using it. It's useful for events that are less than 10 minutes and over a minute in duration. So if anyone kind of fits into that cohort, steeplechasers, 800 meters, 1500 meters, 3Ks, 2Ks, anything like that, beta alanine can be useful. It increases your body's level of carnosine, which helps with lactic acid buffering and shuttling in your body, preventing it from building up as quick. Some GA players have called it, or said it's like having 3 lungs, but that's a bit of an overstatement, to be honest. If you're going to use beta alanine, again, wouldn't be recommended for a teenager. Anything that affects the pH balance in your body or can do that, shouldn't really be tied around with, not at a young age and not without oversight. But if you are going to use it, 6 grams a day for the 4 weeks, so every day for 4 weeks prior to your key event, that's really important. Otherwise, it's not actually going to work. It takes a month to really kick in. Same with creatine monohydrate, by the way, that takes about 20 days at that dosage for it to become effective. It's not an immediate thing, whereas beetroot, more of an acute thing. There's 2 more. Caffeine, which is my favorite. You're looking at getting around 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine for about 45 minutes if you wanted to, cut it tight before a workout. It doesn't really matter if it's 45 minutes, 90 minutes, 2 hours. It takes 45 minutes to spike in your system after you drink it. So if this was a cup of coffee, this is decaf tea because it's later in the evening. If this was coffee and I drank this at 7 a.m. on the dot, it would just about be spiked in my system right now. And it stays spiked for about 6 hours. So it has a half-life of 6 hours. So if you do a training session, you've had a strong coffee 2 hours, 3 hours beforehand, it's still active. You mightn't necessarily feel it, but it's still having an effect. And what caffeine does is it improves your central nervous system function. So you're more alert. You can coordinate things better, basically. And for a technical sport like a race walker, it just makes the mental aspect of it a little bit simpler, I guess. But that can be extended to high jumpers, hurdlers, anyone where you're running, moving, thinking about technique at the same time. Caffeine can help that. It also blunts your sense of fatigue. And how it does that is there are things called ADP receptors in your brain. Caffeine sits in there and blocks them, prevents adenosine from slotting in there. So if you have adenosine slotting into those ADP receptors, that's typically when you feel sleepy and not off. Caffeine essentially stops that from occurring, which is why people feels like it gives them energy. It just makes you not tired. It's not the same thing. What is 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine? So for someone like me, that would be 240 milligram dose. Bear in mind now, you shouldn't consume more than 400 milligrams of caffeine on any given day. And apart from coffee, things like tea, green tea, chocolate, even Coca-Cola, they all have caffeine in them as well. Coffee will be the strongest thing you will drink in all likelihood. And espresso has 80 milligrams. Filter coffee, so from like those AeroPresses or French presses, at around 120. And caffeine pills, caffeine gum is 200. So that's pretty strong. I recommend people stay around that 3 mark just from a safety point of view. Again, if you're under the age of 15, 16, not one to be messing around with. It's okay to have a cup of coffee, but I wouldn't be doing high dose caffeine regularly or at a young age. It's not the place to start. If you're looking for performance enhancement, make sure you do all the basics right first. Sleep, train consistently, recover properly, have a decent diet, do the S&C, do the stretching, do what your coach says. If you do all that for a year or 2 and you still think there's room for improvement here, you can try the caffeine, the beta alanine. It's really the top of the performance pyramid. It doesn't really work unless you're doing all the other things as well. So the last evidence-based supplement is sodium bicarbonate, and essentially it's another lactic acid buffer. It works a little bit differently. You take it more acutely. So you're looking at 0.2 grams per kilogram of body weight the day before your event, and you take it in 3 split doses with some carbohydrates. Never, ever take this on race day. Okay, never do it. Anyone in the sprinting community has heard a story of someone who's used sodium bicarbonate and has puked their guts up, either warming up or after their event. To avoid that, you take it the day before. Your bicarbonate levels will still be high the following day. It'll still do the same thing. You just minimize the risk of tummy upset. This isn't one I typically suggest people to go for. The beta alanine is a little bit safer. This is something you don't really do without oversight from, again, someone like myself or equivalent. So not really a fan of this. And as I said, other supplements like your vitamin D sprays, vitamin K, omega-3s, kind of depends on your diet, your background, your scenario. If you have questions on that, let me know. I don't like multivitamins. So if you have a multivitamin, there's a good chance you probably don't need it. And in a multivitamin, there's a lot of, what will we say, inhibitory molecules. So if there's zinc, that's going to impair iron absorption. If there's copper, magnesium, calcium as well, they all bind together and chelate, and you end up pooing most of them out. So not a fan of a multivitamin, I never have been. You supplement specifically if you're going to do that. So again, that requires a little bit of oversight. Okay, so energy restriction. This is something I said I was going to talk about, as it's becoming more and more prevalent with the, I suppose, the sporting community that's becoming more and more fixated on how they look, looking like an athlete, fad diets. It's more available than ever and more accessible to find, I suppose, damaging information. And from what I see, athletes feel increasingly under pressure to look like athletes, and whatever they feel is necessary to be done to do that, that's what they do. For the most part, it's skipping meals, fad diets, crash dieting, starvation, even laxative usage, things like that, in an attempt to look like an athlete and to achieve performance. It's not the best. It's unfortunate that this happens, and I've seen the side effects. I've seen what can happen when athletes do this. They're not pretty at all. And you have to understand that from a performance point of view, there's that general assumption there that the lighter you are, the better you'll perform, or the leaner you look, the more of an athlete you are. That's just not 100% true. In some sports, weight does obviously affect exercise economy, your ability to jump high, things like that, even heat transfer. But the methods that a lot of people use to lose weight, they're more damaging than they are helpful. And if you're under the age of 18, or if you're coaching someone who is, the goal should never be body composition. And one thing that, I've seen time again that isn't often a cause of this problem for particularly an adolescent athlete or a college age athlete is a coach giving them an arbitrary weight to be. So they'll say, listen, you need to be X kilos, without really any consideration of how to do that, no guidance on it, and what their current weight is. And that puts a lot of pressure on the athlete. Not a fan of that. That's something that I'm trying to, I suppose, advocate against. But let's look at what can happen when you don't eat enough. And just before we do, generally speaking, everything I've just talked about, if you engage in these things, hit your carbohydrates, nail your recovery, pay attention to those details, be consistent, and obviously train hard, that typically results in a better performance and long term, doing the boring things really, really well. That's how you become a professional athlete. And the only difference between professionals and everyone else in terms of how they look, it's repetition. It's really boring. If you asked any of them, how did you get calves like that? Or, how are you in such good shape? They'll show you their training diary, and they'll show you what they eat and how they eat and how professional they are. And that's, it's no surprise. It doesn't happen with, dietary restriction, starving yourself, skinny teas, anything like that. It's doing the boring stuff really well. And as much as I'm interested in nutrition, I'm well aware that to do it properly, it's a little bit boring. That's okay. It's still important to do it. So a couple of things to bear in mind if you see an athlete that you're working with that's obviously losing weight, they're getting leaner, or their sessions are starting to maybe go south, or their recovery is not what it used to be, or just generally they don't seem themselves. It's an important thing to watch out for. These are some of the side effects. So on the left are the potential effects of having relative energy deficiency syndrome, which essentially kicks in if you've been restricting long enough, you're in enough of a calorie deficit that you don't have enough raw materials, energy to provide for general basic function. Everyone, I'm sure, has heard of female athlete triad, and that's kind of where it started. Relative energy deficiency syndrome was a relatively new diagnosis or a framework for thinking about it that includes men and women. So this affects both genders. On the right this is maybe what you might see in an athlete. So what you might look for alongside obvious signs that, you know, they're not very healthy. So they're getting sick a lot, lots of injuries. They're irritable. They're not interested in training. Their performance is obviously going down the hill, or their ability to do technical elements of their sport is dropping. If you see any of these things, it might be worth a quick chat. You know, what's your diet like? Have you done a blood test recently? That can go an awful long way. And just even showing a little bit of concern, if you're a parent or a coach, as to an athlete's welfare, that can spark off the initial, there might be something wrong here. And your GP, sports physician, sports dietitian, whoever it might be, they'll start to test for these problems. So if you have REDs, or if you're over restricting, what can happen for a female, and this is the reason that it's more obvious in women, they lose their menstrual cycle. And that's as a result. With energy restriction, you get a massive spike in cortisol levels, which affects sleep actually as well, interestingly enough. So you're more tired, but you can't sleep. But with that big cortisol spike, that affects how your body essentially governs sex hormones. So menstrual cycles can disappear, and this is not uncommon. A side effect of a menstrual cycle disappearing is a direct effect on bone health. So recurrent stress fractures or a low score on a DEXA scan should always prompt, what's your diet like? Have you lost weight recently? Is there any foods you avoid? Do you have any rigid food rules? They often go hand in hand. And with the female athlete triad, that's really the main thing: low body weight, low bone density, and amenorrhea. It sometimes is or isn't with an eating disorder or iron deficiency. Outside of that, some other things that can kick in: you can have anemia, so that's the hematological. You can have low white blood cells, so your immune system is compromised, which directly impacts on how you can recover, hence that poor recovery and slow decline of an athlete. Resting heart rate can drop. So here's a really interesting one. If you are an athlete and you're watching your resting heart rate, or you're a parent or a coach and you're tracking your athlete with their resting heart rate, if you're concerned that, are they eating enough, or, you know, they're losing a little bit of weight, if they have a very low resting heart rate, that for the most part means they're very, very fit. But if someone has an undiagnosed eating disorder, or they're not consuming enough food, that very low heart rate is actually a medical symptom called bradycardia. It's very low heart rate as a result of your heart muscle atrophying. And that is something that is often mistaken in these athletes, where, you know, they look at their watch and think, God, I'm wicked fit. I'm you know, my heart rate is 40. What I'm doing must be ideal. And it's important to note that when an athlete starts restricting first, because that cortisol spike happens when your energy intake is very, very low, you feel artificially good. And for about 6 to 8 weeks, training can be really, really good. So it's artificial. It's like you're being propped up on adrenaline. You've heard the term running on fumes. That's literally what happens. So it can shape the perception for someone that, no, this is actually a good thing to do, because they see their training going well. And just again, two things that you might take away from this. Number one, performance and how you look, or body fat levels, should never really be correlated. And, you know, you should never tell someone you look very fit or you look very unfit. As nonchalant as it might seem, for some people that can actually have a pretty sharp psychological impact. So watch that one. Number two, don't comment on what an athlete eats. This used to bug me. If someone saw me eating chocolate, they'd say, hey, listen, you can't do that. You're an athlete. And one of the last points I'll make is, this is actually the last slide. There is no evidence ever anywhere that exists to suggest that this kind of clean eating, no junk food, like monk type diet is good or better for performance than a balanced diet, where you tick all the boxes, get your 5 a day, get your fiber in, and do the things I've mentioned. Having a small portion of chocolate or whatever, it's not necessarily damaging. There's just this general idea or a general myth that it is. And that's where this notion of food rules or athletes must eat a certain way comes from. and that can actually kick off all of this. So if you take that away with you, food for thought, think about that. You might prevent some athletes from slipping down into this. I can tell you it's very, very prevalent. And in males, it's underdiagnosed, as the first symptom usually is the loss of a menstrual cycle, which for lads, that's not, that's not really relevant. So yeah, I'm gonna end it there. Thank you guys for listening. If you guys have any questions, or if you want to get in touch, at eLynchFitNut on Instagram, or my website is evanlynchfitnut.com. If you just Google Evan Lynch, it'll pop up. And if anyone's looking to work with me, again, please do get in touch. Or if you just have a question, just let me know, just ask. I'm pretty responsive. I never mind answering questions. I know nutrition is a confusing topic for most people. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to answer some questions. There are 2 here already. So if you do have questions, lump them in now and we'll get to them. If you don't want to ask, just get in touch, reach out, and I promise I will reply in a relatively timely manner. So first one, just wondering, what about carb intake for a type 2 diabetic with insulin resistance? It's a great question. So with type 2 diabetes, obviously, this isn't really a medical talk, but I'm a qualified dietitian, so I can answer this. With diabetes, yes, you have an impaired ability to consume glucose. What I would suggest for you, probably go for that 4 grams per kilogram of body weight per day approximately. But at your meals, you're making sure that your carb sources are high fiber. Okay, so maybe not the meal right before training. You might want to make that something smaller, like just a banana, or a bowl of porridge. That's relatively slow release, and it's kind of a compromise between heavy and light food. So back to what I was saying, for the most part, carbs are whole grains. You have balanced meals, so carbohydrates, lots of vegetables, a bit of protein. That'll slow down the release profile, so your blood glucose isn't going to go up. For the most part, type 2 diabetes is heavily impacted by your fat intake. So things like butter, frying things in oil, drop that out if you can. And if you think you have a bit of body weight to lose, excuse me, dropping some body fat can really, really help with insulin resistance, as it drops liver fat, and that in turn prevents and decreases cholesterol transport. And you'll often see people, when they lose weight, glycemic control returns a little bit. Lady who asked that question, get in touch with me. Maybe we can have a bit more of a specific chat. There's an awful lot that goes into managing a diabetic person. I don't know if you're taking medication. I don't know how long you've been diabetic. I don't know if you've got other things going on. So if you get in touch, we can have a more in-depth discussion just on Instagram, whatever. You don't have to book in or anything like that. Just send me a message maybe outside of this talk and we can chat. Okay. Can you make your own electrolytes? Yes, you can. Class question. You can make your own sports drinks, and I do it frequently. So what you want to do, and think about, let's say if we want to make our own Lucozade Sport, 500 ml bottle of Lucozade Sport, there's around 30 grams of carbohydrates in there. The way I see it, you have 2 options. You can put in about 250 ml of orange juice and 250 ml of water. So you're getting somewhere like 25-30 grams of carbohydrates in there. And to make your electrolyte part, table salt. Sodium is the most prominent electrolyte that you lose, so you don't need a fancy electrolyte tablet, particularly if you're a teenager or you're a parent putting something together for their child. Pinch of salt, that's actually all you need. So if you have one of those little salt mills, just 1 crack, that's all they need. If you are liable to have tummy problems, Maltodextrin Powder, okay, you can get this very, very cheaply online. A scoop of that into your water, pinch of salt, and some vanilla essence or a squeeze of lemon juice, and that's a tummy-friendly homemade sports drink. Really, really easy. It's really tasty. That's actually what I make most of the time if I'm going training, because I can get a dodgy tummy. So yes, Homemade electrolytes for the win. You don't have to buy them. It doesn't have to be expensive. And it's often, it's fun. It makes it more interesting. You're more in control if you can do it yourself. So yeah, great question. I was wondering on the subject of caffeine, is there any drink that you should avoid, or is it okay to drink high caffeine drinks like Monster, Red Bull, and Boost? I drink them on race day before. Okay. So here's a myth that I'm about to bust. Things like the sugar-free Monsters, Red Bulls, and Boost, if they're sugar-free, they're not that bad for the most part. They have the same, if not less, caffeine than a cup of coffee. It's just they have a bad rap. The sugar ones, probably not the best thing to do. For general health, irrespective of how much you exercise, it's never a good idea to drink sugary drinks. For the diabetic person listening, drinking sugar-sweetened beverages is actually one of the main things that causes diabetes. If you were looking at dietary patterns, that's always correlated with diabetic diagnosis after a couple of years. So from a tummy issue point of view, you want to avoid carbonated things that can make you a bit gassy, a bit bloated. You can have a coffee. You can have a very strong cup of tea. It's okay to have those Monsters, Red Bulls, no more than one a day. If you're going to have one, make it sugar-free. Generally, though, I prefer to see people drinking coffee, as at least in coffee, there's antioxidants, polyphenols, things like that can actually be beneficial for your health, whereas there's not really any of that in those energy drinks. But for the most part, they don't deserve the bad rap that they have. And I know that's not a popular thing to say, but that's actually the truth. Probably wouldn't be recommending them if you're under the age of 15, 16, though, at the same time, even if it's a sugar-free one. But they are okay. They're not as demonized as they deserve to be, or at least it shouldn't be. But yeah, natural is always better if you can. Okay, so what kind of diet would I recommend to a 10 to 12-year-old training 2 or 3 times a week? Okay, so generally, a couple of general heuristics here. The food pyramid, for the most part, will cover someone that age. So if I was to make breakfast for a 10, 12-year-old, my daughter's only 1.5, so we're not quite there yet with the track and field ambitions, but we're give her a few years. Breakfast would be something like a bowl of porridge, or it would be a bowl of bran flakes, or maybe some whole grain toast and a boiled egg, maybe a cup of fruit. That would be it. Keep it nice and simple. Lunch, what I would often suggest for a kind of a child athlete, in your lunchbox, 2 pieces of fruit, vary the colors, let them pick. The more varied the color is and the more control they have over their lunchbox, the more they feel in control and autonomous, the more likely they are to voluntarily eat healthily. So if you make it feel like it's their choice, they always engage better. 2 colorful fruits. My favorites would be plums and mixed berries. Kids love those, massive antioxidant content. If they can have nuts, I know a lot of schools can't have nuts now, but if they can, or some kind of mixed seeds, I would be putting those in. Definitely a pot of yogurt, so Greek, skyr, or quark yogurt. And then a sandwich, so a simple sandwich, whole grain bread or a wrap or a pita with some lean protein like your chicken, turkey, or beef, tuna if they like it. I don't meet many kids who like tuna, and putting 1 or 2 salad bits on that. If that's what their lunchbox looks like, that's a great that's a great lunch. And if they're up for doing something like that, that gets them through Monday to Friday, 40 hours a week, essentially, very well fueled up. So generally, 2 pieces of fruit, nuts and seeds if they can. I'm not sure if that's allowed anymore. Definitely a pot of yogurt, and then your starchy, your main event, so your sandwich. That's really it. Things that like lunches and dinners, that plate well guide, so that I made my face into a plate there earlier on. Half veg, but a fist of carbohydrates, and for protein, about a palm-sized portion. That would be for lunch and dinner. Keep it as simple as that. If your kids are picky, so I didn't actually eat fruit until I was about 13 or 14. I was a monumental challenge, ironically enough. What can help? Kids emulate their parents. If you force them, or if you put veg on their plate, there's a great chance they won't eat it. So what you can do, big bowl of veg in the middle of the table that you take and put on your plate, and you make a point of acknowledging that, it's really nice, you feel better when you eat it, they might not necessarily immediately emulate you, but they will eventually. Generally, if you force healthy eating on a child, they will not eat healthily. They will rebel every time. So I hope that helps. There's nothing majorly different. You just obviously wouldn't be giving them the supplements. Perhaps an omega-3 oil, so the cod liver oil capsules and the vitamin D spray wouldn't be the worst idea. Lean red meat, so your lean mince or a little bit of steak once or twice a week to keep their iron levels nice and high. For girls, when they get to the age of 12, there's a big puberty spike there, so they're more liable to get something like anemia. That happens to the lads at around 14 or 15. So that's just one to watch out for. Before, during, and after training, really, really simple. Muju, that chocolate milk, a 250 ml carton, that's okay to have after training. Kids love that as well. That takes care of most of the recovery guidelines. And before training, an hour and a half beforehand, just a banana. That's really enough, as long as there's been like lunch or dinner within 3 hours before that training session. I hope that helps. If you have any more questions on that, just pop them in there and I will get to them. I have a few more questions here. So I'm working with 2 athletes, one middle distance, one martial arts. Runner needs endurance, martial arts, very specific body weight. Hydration is hard at the moment. 0 toilets available. I'm not really sure if that's a question. Let me just read that. If you're finding hydration really difficult, and it's probably because you're overthinking it. So from what I'm understanding here, if you need to use a toilet, it means you're possibly overhydrating. So you're consuming too much or you're chugging. Don't do that. Sip your fluids. And if you go back to those guidelines, that 35 mils per kilogram of body weight per day as a baseline, that's a good place to start. And getting in your 5 mil per kilogram, just sipped, 400 mil sipped over an hour and a half is not that much. Do try and go to the toilet before you exercise. That can help a lot. And if you're using toilets because of another issue, like number 2, watch your fiber and fat intake prior to training. That can cause you to need to go to the toilet quite urgently. Otherwise, there's not really much I can advise from a nutrition point of view. It's more of a logistical thing. So yeah, I'm not really sure if that was a question. Can a high protein diet cause constipation or swollen feet? It depends. So it depends if someone is, say, very sick. Swollen feet usually is that's to do with fluid balance and oncotic pressure. So if you have swollen feet, you have something called edema for the most part. Now, I'm not sure if this is exactly what's going on. Protein intake wouldn't necessarily directly influence this. Albumin status. So if your albumin level is low, that alters the oncotic pressure of your blood or the serum in your body, could cause water retention. It's usually as a result of a medical condition. I can't really say. There's loads of things that can happen there, and protein doesn't necessarily always directly influence albumin status. That can be affected by inflammation or being acutely ill. So yeah, again, it's not really a sports nutrition question, to be perfectly honest. And just another comment there, the food pyramid has been repeatedly disputed due to high GI index. Do I agree? So the food pyramid, that's aimed at general populations, or really it's meant for kids as well. And it's just a template for eating healthily. Athletes, the food pyramid doesn't really hit the nail on the head for all athletes for the most part. And one issue there. So some people perceive the food pyramid differently than it necessarily is meant to be. And it can often be down to the pictures, believe it or not, on the food pyramid. So if you have the bread on the food pyramid as white, people assume that white bread is is what's being suggested. What the food pyramid really says is most of your carbohydrates should be from whole grain sources, and you should get grains, pulses, legumes, rices, oats in, assuming you're not celiac, of course. And the reason that is that helps you get your fiber intake up. Most people get most of their B vitamins, micronutrients, and iron from those types of foods. And as you go up the pyramid, the idea is you consume less and less of those products. So if I recall properly, is it veg at the bottom? See, I don't really use the food pyramid that much because it's just kind of a general guideline. I'm more specific when I'm working with people. Carbohydrates and vegetables and fruits are what you need mostly. That's not really disputed. It doesn't necessarily mean it's all high glycemic index. There's nothing wrong with the food pyramid. It's not how I live my life. It's not what I use to coach people. It's just a general public health message. For the most part, it's pretty on the money. Limit your intake of processed foods, limit your intake of sources of saturated fat, increase whole grains, fruits, and veggies. For the most part, that reduces your risk of most conditions. So I agree with food pyramid. It's just a little bit vague when you're trying to be specific. So a few more questions here. I don't drink coffee. Can I get the same benefits from strong tea? It would have to be very strong tea. A cup of tea has around 40 milligrams of caffeine for the most part, maybe 60. So no is the answer there. If you're not a coffee drinker and you want to try caffeine as an ergogenic aid, you're probably looking at caffeine gum or a caffeine pill. They typically come in 200 milligram doses, 150, 200 mgs. They're quite strong. It is something you would absolutely want to be trying out in 2 or 3 sessions before you ever do it on race day. If you're prone to anxiety, this is somewhere I wouldn't even go. High dose caffeine, if you're anxious, it can just massively amplify that, and it can give you heart palpitations as well. So if you're not a coffee drinker, you're not looking to be a super duper high performance athlete, personally, I wouldn't bother. Just focus on everything else, and you'll still improve your performance if you tighten up on your diet. You don't need to go the whole hog on it. That would be my answer. The girls need to alter their diet during their time of the month. Not necessarily alter it, just making sure that number one, your protein requirement is met, so that 1.6 grams per kg of body weight per day. That will be important. If they're having nasty side effects like PMS type symptoms, what can help is getting enough magnesium and pyridoxine or vitamin B6 in your diet. That's relatively easy to do. So sometimes a ZMA supplement, so the zinc, magnesium, the A, I don't know what the A stands for. There's no ingredient in it that begins with A, but they're called ZMAs. That gives you the zinc, the magnesium, and vitamin B6 actually. So that can help. It has all the suggested things that can help with any symptoms that might pop up. So excess fatigue, pain, bloating, things like that can be helped there. High fiber diets, staying active, doing some cognitive behavioral therapy, that can help as well at the time of the month. Making sure your overall intake of iron is met would be a good idea. For more specifics on female athlete nutrition, I actually wrote an online course called Her Fuel. If you just type in Her Fuel, you'll find it. I think there's like 20 different sections in it. It's 30,000 words. It's hours of video of me talking about every specific bit for a female athlete. Managing around the menstrual cycle was one of them. PMS was one of the issues we brought up, and general requirements for a female athlete. But what I've just said there, those really be the footnotes you'd need to bear in mind for an athlete there. Obviously, during that menstrual time and the few days in and around that, tough training would be absolutely not advised. Even if they're up for it and motivated, not a great idea. And definitely, discourage fasted training and low carbing it or skipping meals if possible at all. If you don't want to take supplements to meet your B6, rice cakes, massive source of B6, fortified cereals, fortified milk, and to get your magnesium, some dark chocolate, some Brazil nuts. That's simple as it can be. Juvenile jumper is part advisable on the morning of a competition. Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing wrong with it. 100%, 3 hours before the event and getting nearer to it, something like a banana. And for jumpers in particular, those competitions can go on for quite a while, particularly if it's a juvenile and there might be like 30 people taking part. Could be there for an hour or two. Bring a kit bag, put some like jellies into it, some dried fruit, a sports drink, and just kind of nibble away during the event. That would be a good idea to just stay topped up. So yes, there's nothing wrong with porridge, perfectly fine. Unless he or she gets tummy issues, then go for a lighter type cereal. But otherwise, no problem with this. Okay, guys, we made it. We are done. It is 8:30, so I'm gonna knock it on the head there. Thank you guys for listening. Most of you are still here, so that's great. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope you found it informative, useful, learned something. If you do want to reach out, Instagram at eLynchFitNut, or find my website. You can get in touch with me vicariously via Grace Lynch. We're actually not related. Get that question a lot. We are good friends though. So I'm going to knock it on the head there. I hope you guys have a nice weekend and that you get to go back training, racing someday soon. And yeah, thank you again. So if anyone does want the slides from today, just let me know and you'll be able to get them. Okay, guys, thank you. See you later.